Hello and welcome to this event organised by the Estonian Embassy in the UK, which forms part of the London Festival of Architecture. My name is Owen Hopkins and it's my pleasure to be chairing this discussion of one of the 20th century's greatest architects, Louis Kahn, who was born 120 years ago back in February of this year. Kahn is not just one of the 20th century's greatest architects, but also, I think, one of its most enigmatic and hardest to pin down or characterize. Critics and historians, and I say this as one myself, like to attach labels to architects and their work, to relate it to others and to situate it in broader histories. Yet Kahn resists this. He sits somewhere between modernism and postmodernism, neither one nor the other, but having characteristics of both. His work is powerfully attuned to its setting, yet has this consistency to it. We know a Kahn building when we see one. His buildings are monumental and quite often massive, yet possess a delicacy, an extraordinary eye for detail. They are both of their moment, but have a universal, timeless quality that appeals to people everywhere, as witnessed by the global audience for this event. Kahn's work, I think it's fair to say, is reflective of a particular sensibility towards structure, towards light, materials, and setting, really towards architecture's very fundamentals. And the question for us today, as it, I guess, is for anyone who looks into Kahn's work, is how that sensibility came about. Where did it come from? And in this event, we go back to the very beginning, to the still surprisingly little known and understood early years in Estonia, where he was born, his travels and his early experiences of its buildings and its landscape. And through that, we will begin to unpick and assess what effect these experiences had on his subsequent approach to architecture and informing such a distinctive architectural sensibility. To do this, we are joined by three speakers who each bring unique insights into Kahn and his work. Each of the speakers will deliver a short presentation, after which there will be time for discussion and questions from you, the audience. And if you have a question, please write it in the comments below the live stream video on the Louis Kahn Estonia Foundation's website at any point during the event, and our team will pick it up and it'll be fed to me and I will be able to ask it of our speakers. And incidentally, if you wish to support the organization and their work, there's a link on that page as well. So now, to the first of our speakers, and I'll introduce each of them before their respective presentations. Dr. Heie Treier is a Tallinn-based art historian. She lectures at the Baltic Film, Media and Art School of Tallinn University. Her writing spans early modernist painting to contemporary art. She's a former editor of Kunst magazine, and her latest book, 100 Years of Photography in Estonia, was published in 2019. She will be giving us an insight into her research into Kahn's Estonian origins, which she is working on in collaboration with the artist Anna Masik and graphic designer Martin Pedenik. So, Heie, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to participate in the London Festival of Architecture and honor the architect Louis Kahn. Before starting the brief introduction to our Tallinn-based research about early Kahn, I'd like to once more introduce Arne Maasik, who is architect and uses camera for his visual research, and graphic designer Martin Pedenik. The first impulse for this research came in 2006 during the first Kahn days in Saaremaa, thanks to the vision of Nathaniel Kahn. The idea was that there should exist a Baltic viewpoint in Kahn research. Louis Kahn was born on the Ösel Island, which is now Saaremaa, and he lived in Arensburg town, which is now Kuressaare. The name Arensburg still exists as the name of a small, intelligent spa hotel close to the castle. When starting this research, it soon became very clear that little is known about Kahn's early childhood. The most valuable source has been the architect himself, of course, and his family. Here, I'd like to focus on 2 years, 1904 and 1928. When talking to the students of Rice University, Louis Kahn was asked, when did he become an architect? And the answer was at the age of 3. So what happened in 1904? The fire accident traumatized the child and women surrounding the child in 1904. Yet Kahn never said that he came from the island where he got the scars. Instead, he said he came from the island with a castle. In 1904, the owners of the castle decided to start modernizing the medieval structure. Louis Kahn's father worked as an officer near the castle. The 3-year-old seemed to have had some kind of special experience in his soul related to the castle. Psychologists of child development say that the first 3 years are crucial in the life of any person. The mother and children emigrated to the USA in 1906. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, 27-year-old architect traveled to Europe. Art historian Michael Lewis calls it the Grand Tour. Actually, the map should be, this is very general map, actually. I found it in internet, but it gives a general idea. So here is the Baltics. I'm talking about this part of the world. He took a boat from Helsinki to Tallinn and then a train from Tallinn to Riga. Riga is the kind of capital of the Baltic states historically. And in Riga, there were many relatives of Louis Kahn. So in June, July, he stayed in Riga and also took a boat from Riga to Saaremaa to visit Grandma Liina. And Tyng was very confident that he visited Saaremaa. We found a document in the Estonian archive that he took a 2-month Estonian visa, which shows his plans. According to our hypothesis, this is just a hypothesis, that he probably wanted to test his idea or his memory, early childhood memory about the castle. And it's very probable that he was also in the Baltics, he was drawing a lot. The drawings are lost, and it's possible that he also sold drawings to finance his trip. This is what Michael Lewis writes. Now, some words about the 14th century castle. It represents convent type of building that was very typical to the Teutonic order on the territory of contemporary Germany. It also had relations with Nordic countries, especially Gotland Island, which belongs to Sweden nowadays. Here you can see the Saaremaa Island and the Gotland Island. So they had very close ties in the medieval times, in the medieval period, influencing each other. Some architectural elements originate from medieval Prague, and the surrounding bastion system was built by the Swedish power in the 17th century. This is maybe said military Baroque. The castle represents power architecture built by men and meant for men, for monk, soldiers, and for the bishop. So this image is edited image because the Soviets changed facade. So nowadays you cannot see the same kind of facade what Louis Kahn saw. And the key words are square, strong central axis, inner courtyard, hard access, towers, corners, walls, small windows outside, bigger windows inside. So outside the windows were originally very, very small. And I guess it was quite dark in these spaces. The inside windows are bigger, so lots of light coming in. And fortification. The ceiling design is important in Gothic architecture. Here is the quotation by An Tung. The Exeter Library, 1972, and the Hurva Synagogue in their great cubic masses with smaller spaces around a great central space evoke the castle at Kahn's birthplace on Saaremaa, end quote. How to comment? The ceiling of the castle is quite low to keep warmth and protection. So the Gothic groin walls are accessible for the viewer who wants to analyze them. At the same time, they represent European Gothic system in general. The Gothic ceiling design has both a theological meaning and constructional function. So here is the quotation of Kahn himself about looking up. The drawing is by Robert McCarter, who happened to be also in Saaremaa in 2006 during the first Kahn days. And he made 5 drawings that have been published, we have published in our publications. And in later years, we have used his drawing as test images or test in order to test our own ideas that Robert McCarter saw something that we didn't see in 2006, and later on we made such a parallel, which leads to another hypothesis. Louis Kahn, who, so to say, didn't have any childhood or youth because of 2 world wars and difficulties. He seemed to have coded his childhood into his buildings while he kept silent. During the Cold War period, the castle didn't make sense anyway. In addition, the Saaremaa island and the castle as if didn't exist during the political confrontation of the Cold War. It never belonged to the global architecture history writing either. When An Tung visited Saaremaa in 1993 after the Berlin Wall, she emphasized that we should also pay attention to the church architecture. There are 5 medieval churches in Saaremaa, very well preserved. They all represent the local school and also carry a wider meanings that go back to Jerusalem, according to my colleague Kersti Markus, who published recently her research about early medieval churches in Scandinavian and Baltic countries. So here are the key words: rose window, Vimperg, portal, which in case of Valjala Church illustrates very funnily what Ervin Panovsky was writing about the difficulties of medieval builders, how to design the rose window and Vimperg in the facade in a proper way. So here it's translated into modernist basic geometry by Kahn. And concerning the parliament building, we see the principle of protection against the sun in the warm country and political protection for the state of Bangladesh. So these are some of our findings during the research. But when traveling, Louis Kahn had eyes for medieval fortification architecture everywhere in Europe, in Scotland, in England, in France, in Italy. But this is already another story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really, really fascinating and a wonderful way to kick things off. I think I won't ask any questions now. I think we'll keep them all for the discussion, because I think a number of the questions I will ask will probably apply to the other speakers too. So we will go straight on to our second speaker in the second presentation. Pierre-Olaf Fjeld is Professor Emeritus at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, where he taught for many years and was rector for 2 terms. He currently runs a small studio with his wife, Emily Randall Fjeld. He received a master's degree at Louis Kahn's masterclass studio at the University of Pennsylvania in 1972 to 1973. And then on his return to Norway, worked with Sverre Fein and for many years and taught together at Oslo. He returned to Philadelphia in 1984 to 85 to research at the Louis Kahn archives. He has lectured throughout the world and has had a number of guest professorships, and in 2010 received an honorary professorship from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, and has also been awarded Knight First Class in the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olav in 2019. He's the writer of numerous books, including, most relevant for today, Louis Kahn and Nordic Latitudes, which was published in 2019. Per-Olaf, over to you.
I would like to thank the Embassy of Estonia for this invitation and for the opportunity to give this small talk. The time in Louis Kahn masterclass at the University of Pennsylvania changed my life. His teaching opened up a different way of thinking, not just in relation to architecture, but life in general. With his comment, life is to express. Meaning then that each one of us has the capacity to create, and in the hope that what we create together can strengthen our understanding and awareness of what it is to be a human being. The desire to write the book Louis Kahn, The Nordic Latitude, with my wife Emily, came about gradually, as it took years, but I felt there were some aspects of Kahn's background, way of thinking and approach to architecture that seems rather fading out of the discussion, almost forgotten. Oddly, it was a personal question from Kahn to me early in the first semester that set a path in which he asked, "Do you know the Norwegian architect Arne Korsmo?" Unfortunately, I did not, and I could see he was disappointed, but his remark haunted me for many years. When I returned to Norway, I landed a job in the office of the Pritzker Prize winner architect Sverre Fein, who had been a student of Korsmo. Fjeld opened a world of Nordic and European connections, and many included some form of connections to Kahn. Over time, this web of interconnection inspired me to dig deeper into Kahn-Nordic ties. My investigation began with his trip to Europe in 1928. After Kahn graduated from Penn, he worked, lived with his parents, and sailed for an extensive study trip to Europe. And in May of 1928, he landed in England, traveled there for a few weeks, then on to Holland, and up to Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Helsinki. Then, nearing midsummer, he left for Riga, where his grandmother lived, and a side trip to Saaremaa, where some of his mother's siblings still resided. Then, after a few weeks, he headed south through Germany, Austria, and finally down to Venice. By 1928, the shift of European architecture was well underway, and though Kahn had a very traditional travel plan for the time, which included a number of Boers art buildings, such as the City Hall in Stockholm by Ragnar Östberg, there were also sketches of modernist building in his sketchbook. Though to visit an architectural object was one thing, but to experience the landscape, his mother tongue, and the Nordic culture over again as a young architect must have been a very moving experience, and not in the least the Nordic light at midsummer. In Scandinavia, there are many important architectural work finished or in the process of being built at the time of Kahn's trip. The culture and architectural exchange between the Nordic countries, including Estonia and Latvia, was good. There was new interesting projects in most of the major towns. The Stockholm Public Library by Gunnar Asplund was just completed, and the Woodland Cemetery just outside the city was open with work by both Asplund and Leverance. The train station in Helsinki by Saaremaa and the great Grundtvig Church by Kåre Klint in Copenhagen were also buildings Kahn visited. But just as important, the ideas behind the modernist movement were quickly taking hold through the North. The Stockholm exhibition of 1930 was in the planning stage in search of a new architectural agenda, where social aspects of living were in the forefront. Aalto was working on many of his first iconic modernist buildings at the time, including the Paimo Sanatorium. This was Arne Korsmo's background when he departed from Oslo on a study tour to visit new functionalist work in late summer of 1928. From Venice, Kahn headed for Rome and accidentally met Korsmo on a train. They toured Rome and southern Italy together, and from this point stayed in touch the rest of their life. They were the same age, had many things in common, and enjoyed each other's company. Clearly, the sites they visited in Rome and farther south fascinated Kahn, and his later visit would serve as an inspiration for his work. But I strongly think the core ideas that were the foundation of early 20th century Nordic architecture, such as respect and understanding of nature, that the space should have daylight, accessibility, and that the quality of the space itself was essential in architecture, were clearly present in Kahn's later work and thinking. After the trip, Kahn returned home to the 1930 Great Depression. In exploring the Kahn archives, I began to understand that as a young architect, he was truly in search of a particular type of architectural identity. Later, he would test various styles and materials, and in a sense, he mastered their expression, but it was not him. I think he was searching for something far more fundamental to architecture's core essence. One project with George Howe and Oscar Stonrow was a turning point, the Carver Court Federal Housing Project. from 1944. It's not a coincidence that Kahn was interested in social housing and a social behavior at the time, and it was embedded in his background and mirrored all that was unfolding in the Nordic country. It is a beautifully expressed in his saying, architecture is an extension of ourselves. It expresses our humanness. The town hall extension by Gunnar Asplund in Göteborg is very much a good example of this attitude. By 1949, Kahn was teaching at Yale. It was a fruitful time. Not only did the students appreciate him, but he made many new friends and acquaintances, among them Joseph Alberts and Eero Saarinen. Kahn tested and presented ideas through teaching and was soon awarded a grant to study at the American Academy in Rome. And he would revisit many of the places that he explored with Cosmo on his first trip. Oddly, about half a year before Kahn left for Rome, Cosmo visited Kahn in Philadelphia, along with his wife, designer Grete Prytz Kittelsen. Cosmo has attended the SIAM meeting in Bergamo in Italy a few months earlier. He was very impressed what the post-war architecture centered around Milan from Franco Albini and the Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck. And it's likely the SIAM meeting was discussed on some level at this time. Cosmo followed Kahn up to Yale and then continued his trip meeting up with Jørn Utzon on the left and his wife in Chicago. They traveled west and down through Mexico and Guatemala, and Kahn boarded a ship for Europe some months later. The second Rome trip was a landmark in his career, as he was offered a commission to design the new Yale Art Gallery while in Rome. Its search for a direct relationship between structure, material, daylight was already evident in his architectural approach, but even so more in this gallery. The Yale Art Gallery, and a couple of years later, the Trenton Bathhouses of 54, 59, gave Kahn international recognition. Both projects were published and discussed in the Nordic countries, and an inspiration for many architects at the time, and the strong interest actually grew through Europe. His architecture had an architectural language of its own, one that could not really be copied, and it was fresh. In 1959, Peter Smithson and Alison Smithson planned to publish some of Kahn's latest work, and at the same time sent an invitation to the SIAM Otterlo meeting of 1959. In Kahn's speech, he commented somewhat critically of the content, and I quote him, "I believe there are many in our profession who rely entirely upon the actual design and very little on the way of thought as to what the thing wants to be before they try to develop the design, the solution of the problem," quoting finished. This visit was also his first physical meeting with Aldo van Eyck, whose architecture and thinking had inspired him for some time. Arne Cosmo attended this meeting, but there were a number of other people there who would come later. We become friends and inspiration in the latter of Kahn's life. In particular, Kenzo Dange and Aldo van Eyck, both in the picture. The correspondence between Smithson and Kahn was something in itself. The Smithson asked over and over again for a material with more and more extravagant envelopes and letters, but Kahn was difficult to reach. Most of the people at the SIAM meeting also attended the World Design Conference in Tokyo a half year later. Cosmo and Kahn met up once again and had a memorable time together. Years later, whenever one of these pictures was published in a book, Cosmo was always referred to as the unknown. Kahn made a Scandinavian lecture tour some years later. He praised the vernacular architecture and Viking ships and joked that the Oslo Tonehold had stolen his idea. At this point in time, he was a well-established architect with many prestigious commissions. It has often been said that Kahn started his own office rather late. And it's true that he was over 50 when he began work on the Yale Art Gallery. But experience and earlier work cannot be disregarded, as everything of interest was transformed into a content of his own. Kahn was a person driven by architecture, and there was nothing, including himself, that could stop or mediate this drive. Going through his personal notebook, I was struck by his passion, his drive to understand the creative process. As a mature architect, it seems as if Kahn's interpretation of the beginning of things was the essential element to drive his own work forward. This deep focus upon understanding or sensing the core beginning of any architectural project was also a key element in the classroom. It was important to get in touch with our own creative process. Within each assignment, finding the architectural core in the project was a challenge. To express the core was what he called a form drawing. It meant we had to question what is the project. For him, what was more important than how and why. This, among many other words and phrases, faced us each session, and it was not always easy to follow as a young student. This pedagogy was not suited for everyone, as there were not set answers nor method. It was a search into the room of architecture, which had a particular energy, and this energy could be seen as an extension of our humanity. This brings me to Kahn's search for what he calls the institutional man, an architecture that is understood and sensed by everyone, not by way of signs and symbolic, but spatial inclusion. A space that embraces public consciousness, public well-being. And when visiting his mature work, it is very apparent in the many projects from Salk Institute, the National Assembly Building in Dhaka, the Kimball Art Museum, or Philip Exeter Library. The last two of these projects were finished while I was a student in the master class. In each are struck by a sense of spatial collectiveness, of community, and you are simply not able to escape from its power. One day he brought the working drawing of the Philip Exeter Library to our studio. That day the word institution gained clarity, and at the same moment he also understood what he meant by form drawing. Louis Kahn had a creative mind that belongs to the North. Beyond his clear talent, his work was embedded in a social consciousness, which I believe comes from his upbringing. Despite or because of his years in the inner city of Philadelphia, respect for nature played an essential role. He would argue nature would always win, and that the laws of nature are everlasting, different from what he called the rules of man, which are in a continuous transformation. Kahn left behind some very beautiful buildings, but within his creative approach, there are clues to issues and attitudes that will be essential to the future of architecture and its direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I was just making a note at the very end that clues to the future of architecture in his work, I think is a rather fascinating and tantalizing prospect. So we'll pick up on that in the discussion, no doubt. And so we now move to our third and final speaker, who is Elain Harwood, She is an historian with Historic England. Her proper job title, she says, is an architectural investigator researching buildings and landscapes in England, mainly 20th century, and many to seek their statutory protection. She has a PhD on London's South Bank and has written many books, in particular Space, Hope and Brutalism, which really is the standard text on English modernism. It won the Art Book Award in 2016, and I'm sure other books, other book awards as well. She has written several other books on post-war listed buildings, on the Architects Chamberlain, Powell and Bon, and on Art Deco. And she has a book on mid-century modernism coming in October. She edits the 20th Century Society's journal and gives many lectures and tours, and she says in normal times teaches spin. One thing also to mention is today is Elain's birthday, so we are very fortunate that she has found the time to join us for this event. So Elain, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you for such a nice welcome. And this is probably the best way of actually, if not seeing people, at least communicating with people in these times. And the Spincasters are back on. If you're anywhere near Islington and a member of Nuffield, join me on a Monday night. I am no expert on Kahn. I am a fan. So I'm sorry I'm giving a little contrast to the eminent speakers that have come before. I think my task is to show you my holiday slides and to try and relate to Kahn, to London and Britain, and perhaps sort of big up his universal importance. And perhaps that, as Owen was saying, that's perhaps what is so strong about Kahn, that he takes, he's coming from Beaux-Arts education. He's one of the first architects, born in 1901, so he's contemporary with Rebeckin and Erno Goldfinger, who were in whole or part measure self-taught. Kahn has a very formal education under Paul Klee. He knows his classical sources. He's imbued with Wittkower and architecture in an age of humanism, to which you can add, has been added today very lucidly, an interest in Gothic, an understanding of his northern roots. And I was very struck hearing those talks, how much the Baltic country, if you've been to any of the Baltic countries, if you've been to the American East Coast, how similar a lot of the landscape is. The water of the Baltic is calmer, but much of the landscape is the same, trees, hard landscape. But the buildings have this sort of unique geometry of form that start to come through very late. And so I think let's start with the art gallery, because it's the one that is sort of best known. It was visited by British students. James Stirling studied there. Here's that ceiling that Per Olaf showed so very well. And here's that geometry, here a triangle, which Emily was pointing out in her earlier talk. And it starts even then. Note those sort of putlock holes, which today we associate with Tadao Ando too, don't we? But he got them from Kahn, and this is where they really start appearing, sort of markers of the shuttering or the form for the formwork. And then the Trenton bathhouse, this essential geometry becoming much more cubic, much more square. What we haven't discussed at all is the influence of Anne Ting in any of this, that their professional, personal relationship starts at 47-8, just as Kahn is sort of coming to this greater maturity, if you like. And that's the $1 million question. Here's the setting in a very cold February. Do not go swimming in February. and it's been modernized, but you see the essential simplicity of the materials, the concrete blockwork, the gaps, open spaces left, the simple, very junctions. And we forget that, Kahn made his name with public housing in the 30s and 40s, and then a series of private houses, but they continue to be built in his mature years. And I want this one. It's a house for a single lady with a wall full of books, gallery, large single bedroom, and that to the left, I don't know if you can see the cursor, that's the fold up, fold down bathtub. That lid comes up to reveal the tub when needed. Quite extraordinary. But you see the sort of quality of materials that would be, say, the links very strong between East Coast American architecture and that of Scandinavia and the Baltic countries, very evident. And the Fisher House too, slightly later, a more complex plan in many ways, of two forms linked, and Goldfinger does this too, but Kahn makes a sort of mastery of it, with the fireplace as the divider, and setting the angle and concealing spaces within and around it. And of course, this is actually his most significant building. Is one of the most difficult to photograph because it's boxed in by other buildings and trees, but you get the sense of the laboratory spaces, and then these big service cores, which you find translated into university laboratory buildings elsewhere. That's probably the best angle in which to see them. It has that sort of San Gimignano Tower look. And then you think of the Hunterian by William Whitfield at Glasgow, which I don't have the slide of, and the relationships between Kahn and British architecture perhaps start to become apparent. This is the back of the sock. This is the side you don't see. This is how it's done, if you like, that it's actually a normal cliff top facing the Pacific, bit sandy, perhaps slips a bit, absolutely normal suburban Yahola, could be perhaps anywhere on that Californian coast, and yet it's kind of immortalized as this simple vision, and you have to sort of get to the end to see how it's done, how it's a sort of cheat to create this completely enclosed sort of work, open and yet enclosed, very personalized space with a very unique personal qualities. Again, materiality of concrete and timber, and then the land falling away into these waterfalls. And there's a cafe at the bottom, and kind of normality where all the workers hang out and chat, without any of that sort of formal, hushed reverence that we see in that top bit. Hushed reverence here. Per Olaf's already shown you some images of the Bangladesh capital buildings, but here's the Parliament building ringed with residences and office buildings, and the contrast of materials and shapes makes the sort of served and servant servitude kind of evident here too. And it sits in its own lake just outside Dhaka proper. And here's the back entrance, if you will. The front entrance is sort of like the taxi rank. But here's the prayer hall to one side. I wasn't allowed to take, I shouldn't have taken these. I certainly wasn't allowed to take pictures of the Parliament building, which is in the center, in the core, of course, and then it radiates out in a series of axes and progressions, and these axial, well, not really corridors, are they? They're sort of more atria, and then the staircase of spring. This is the image that I think comes out in the Nathan Kahn film so very, very well. And there's a detail of the lesser buildings there. Most of these pictures, I'm afraid, are from slides, so apologies for the loss of quality in their scanning. But I did get to Ahmedabad only 18 months ago. Seems longer now, of course, but by that time, even I'd progressed to a digital camera. And you see how these elements kind of come together, perhaps, in this very large, relatively late commission. And one of the joys of Kahn, of course, is that his work is not in places that are easy to get to. But you see this sort of great grid here. And these are the buildings that were under threat. I'm sure a lot of you signed, a lot of us have signed that petition against the demolition, which shocking prospect of these simple, again, I think they could be nowhere else but India. If you contrast them with what Le Corbusier and Pierre Generet were doing in Chandigarh, it's taking those elements of brick and concrete, which is essentially an Indian vernacular, but formalizing them in a very particular way. And if the Kahn's buildings in Bangladesh and India don't seem sort of extraordinary, it's a reminder that particularly in Bangladesh, Kahn sort of brought the architectural profession there very much. He brought the concrete industry. There really wasn't a formal architecture before, and he had a very profound influence on subsequent generations of architects. This shows the staff housing at Ahmedabad rather better. And to conclude how that grid is taken up in his last building, the Yale Centre for British Art, which faces the Yale Art Gallery. If you haven't been there, it's probably my favourite street in the world. And how the volumes become very much more simplified at this late stage. So quickly, a few examples. I should have put John Outram's Wadhurst Park in, which is very much inspired by Kimball Art Gallery. Lasden's ceiling may or may not have some connections with what the art gallery was doing. Certainly Lasden was in the States in 54-5 as work began. They're probably the most comparable architects in British terms, with Lasden's sense of monumentality, volume, and particular National Theatre, that sort of very strong sense of access, progression, running through buildings. The exterior here and Royal College of Physicians looking really very different, but internally, I think there's much to compare. Sterling, I mentioned, was teaching at Yale Art Gallery while designing this with James Gowan, leaving Gowan to do a lot of the detailing. But then you go to the sort of secondary stair around the back. Yes, it's cruder, but he could have got that idea of leaving the holes from the board concrete shuttering from nowhere else, particularly given the date. Eldred Evans, friend of Sterling, studied at Yale in 61 after winning a competition for a design for civic officers at Lincolnshire. And she said, as a student at the Architectural Association, 56 to 61, there was Le Corbusier, there was Mies, there was alto, there was aspirand, and then they discovered Kahn. And she found concrete blocks from the Netherlands to produce this building. It was never built because Lincoln City Council never ran the competition before it had bought all the land, never got the land. I'm going to leave you with this house, Richard Burton's house, which he used to open for open house every year. And he always gave his source as the house on the Mesa, an unbuilt scheme by Frank Lloyd Wright. But I was sitting in her kitchen like this, at this huge kitchen table with Richard and his wife Mireille, and I looked up at this space, and yes, the materials are quite different, but that sort of simplicity of geometry took me back to being in the Trenton Bath House. So of course I had to ask the question, where was the source? And yes, indeed, there it was. So thank you very much, Estonian Embassy, for inviting me, and I'll put you back to Owen.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for that sort of whistle-stop tour of Kahn's work from both an expert and a fan. Really enjoyed that, and the influence in Britain was really fascinating as well. So we now have time for discussion between the panelists, and also some questions from the audience. I see some have already been posted, but if you have a question, please post it, and we will pick it up very shortly. But for the moment, I just wanted to ask a few questions to our panelists collectively and individually. And I wanted to come back first, actually, to the I guess the starting point for this event, which are Louis Kahn's Nordic and Baltic connections. And I wanted to ask, I suppose, each of the speakers why they have been underplayed, or why they are not usually seen as, or in a more sort of typical interpretation of Kahn and the sort of more sort of general understanding of him, why they aren't seen as more important, and why have they been underplayed, and why is it so important at the same time that we reverse that? So can I ask, maybe we'll go in the order that we the speakers spoke originally. So Heie Marie, would you like to kick things off?
Yeah, so I have been struggling with the problem or the topic from the very beginning, because all this information that I need, actually we started our research when there was nearly zero information, very, very small sentences scattered in different sources. And actually, researchers trust documents, and they trust archival evidence. And when there is zero, when it is missing, then it seems that the things didn't exist in real life. And that's why maybe it creates kind of distortion or a kind of misunderstanding. And another thing is that Louis Kahn himself, one of his code words was silence. And on the island of Saaremaa, when he comes from, actually, it is a kind of folk tradition that you don't speak about things that are important, that you keep silent about things that are most important. And I don't know if this understanding was well. Anyway, there we may discuss about silence.
Yeah, Olaf.
I spent quite a bit of time in the Kahn collection, several years actually. And there are some traces there, and there are some traces related to his friends, and most of his friends in that sense actually is Nordic, at least related to the letters that we were able to find. So in some way, I don't think he truly had an audience that he could talk to freely or openly about his childhood. At the same time, Kahn loved America, so it's not a competition in this sense, right? So, but it's interesting that it's so much easier to relate him to Italy or the south of Europe, his architecture, and not within sort of the humanness that you strongly has a feeling of when you read his work and his own thoughts, to put it that way. Maria mentioned silence, because in silence, he said, in silence is the will to express. In other words, you don't truly express it, but in it is a will in which then he combines it with light that has the possibility to that expression possible in a way. So at the same time, the people in the north, that's not necessarily taught that much always, and particularly in relation to sort of things that are important to them. Therefore, I think it's also, I think that's one of the reasons why there are not so many sketches of Kahn from the north, because it was embedded strongly in him. Mm. And it was not an image that he was fascinated of, to put it that way. It was deeper than that, I think.
Elaine, is there anything you want to add?
Just a couple of quick things. I mean, he's very much Philadelphia by upbringing, and the opportunities that being in that city gave him for having giving a poor boy an education. But I found myself wondering about where the other immigrants in Philadelphia would come from. He's in a strong Jewish community, and I'd love to know how many other people in Philadelphia at that time had similar roots to him, whether it was normal. And I think the other thing to point out is that all the major published books and writings on Kahn are from Philadelphia or University of Pennsylvania. They're coming from his students and friends and supporters there. So, and it's actually surprising. And they also look very universally. Even when you go to Philadelphia, you've still got to pick him out. It's not an obvious Kahn trail, the way you can stomp around the Le Corbusier museum in Paris, for example.
That's really interesting. So there's this kind of archival response to the question. There's a sort of the personality, and then there's, I guess, the function of where the histories are written, the perspectives they're coming from physically as much as anything else. Another question I had, which I guess is kind of moving away from the reception of the work to him himself, because both Heie and Per Olaf, you sort of hinted towards almost a kind of psychological interpretation of the work. For example, Heie, you talked about how he coded his childhood into his buildings, which I was completely fascinated by, and it sounds so deeply Freudian in so many ways. And Per Olaf, you talked about how he was a person driven by architecture, and how he was sort of driven by this search, as the word you use for this kind of essential architecture. I mean, these types of approaches are kind of, from a sort of methodological perspective, are kind of fraught with difficulty, because one is essentially inferring, speculating, hypothesizing. But I was convinced at the same time by both what you said. But I think how does one kind of does one just have to leave these kind of types of analyses kind of at their natural endpoint? How far is it possible to take them? How certain can we be that these things were in his mind when he was designing, or was it at the back of his mind, or was it about, as I talked about in the introduction, forming this kind of sensibility, this general approach to architecture? Emily, do you want to?
Well, at least I have been testing their ideas for so long time, 10 years, that all the time I'm thinking that no, is it possible? But there are certain such these are not written down, these hints. For example, when I was in Philadelphia, then I listened to Kahn people in Philadelphia discussing things, and I remember they talked that Kahn coded one of the windows of Philadelphia railway station to his architecture, which means that he visited the railway station quite often, and he probably looked at this one window, and then it became part of his architecture. So this is the same pattern. And there was some other such very, very small hints that made sense for me, that gave me courage to come out with this idea.
Olaf, is that, having been taught by the man that we're talking about, and obviously had, the personal interaction, does what Emily described, does that seem? Do you buy the argument? In short.
Well, I think you have to be very open on your question, because nobody really owns Kahn. He did not even own himself. I don't think we ever know what truly drove him in relation to, this search into so-called architectural space. So I think it's an open question, and it has to be open, because he was just like a vacuum cleaner. Everything was interested him to a certain way, and he then had this capacity to form this into a material of its own. So everybody owns Kahn in a way. But what is interesting is sort of the physicality of the language itself. Mm-hmm. For example, one think that maybe he started with a square or started with a circle inside the square, but in his creative approach, the form aspect, these forms, this geometrical form, came in rather late in his work. So this is the beginning of what he talks about, had to be clear before he put a language on it, before he put a physical language on it. Sometimes when he talks about geometry, he said that there is some sort of a commonness of this. It's something that is understood by everyone. So if it then fits with this idea of the beginning, geometry is an instrument in which then has the capacity to perform that institutional attitude that he was striving for. But nobody owns it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think there's some, it's in some ways it's the richness of the work that allows us to infer these different meanings and interpretations in the way that is not possible perhaps with the work of other architects. Elain, I mean, I guess kind of following on from that, I had a question about prepared about, if there was a kind of British equivalent, almost someone who was similarly inspired by kind of these sort of early experiences of sort of historical vernacular architecture and sort of transcended that kind of modern historical sensibility. But you've already kind of answered it by saying Lasdun, which is a really interesting.
Well, I mean, he's one man, but his background of it way back, of course, is non-Brit Nordic too, isn't it? I think it's a Russian origin at Laston as a name. I think it is. But certainly, so not but going back much further. And somebody well worth looking at from that sort of vernacular point of view is somebody like Peter Aldington, who's hoovering up all sorts of sources, but particularly British vernacular, and reinterpreting them using modern materials and strong volumes. But in terms of actual, who's the most influenced by Kahn, I would have to say Evans, but her work largely was either not built or doesn't survive.
We have a few questions that have been posted by the audience, a couple of quite specific ones directed at Per Olaf, so I'll ask those first. Firstly, there's a question about Kahn's visit to open-air museums in Norway and Finland. Are there any notes of these visits? And if so, do they point to the reason he visited them? And there's a related question. There was a Helsinki Metropolitan Area Conference held in 1972. Kahn spoke there a day before Aalto. Are there records of those speeches? And did they meet? I would like to know as well.
Well, there are record of the speeches in his 1968 Scandinavian trip. 1967, says Emily here. And they're recorded in our book, to put it that way. So that's in relation to the open air museum. He was very fascinated by that, and he also talks about it the evening in the evening related to his speech. So he was, I think he was fascinated by the modesty, fascinated by the particular light that enter little or large, to put it that way. And also the materiality and the sort of the life simplicity that was required in order sort of to survive. In that sense, I think it's served as an inspiration for him, again, in which then he had the capacity to translate into his own. Yes, there are, his lecture in Oslo is recorded, and his lecture in Helsinki is recorded in the book. Were there other questions? Yeah. Did I answer them?
I think you have. Yes, you've covered them.
Thank you.
Okay. But just another message to the audience: if you have any questions, please do post them, and they will find their way to me, and I can ask them of the audience. But we are sort of gradually drawing to a close now, and I wanted to kind of ask a few kind of general questions. But where does Kahn sit in the history of modern architecture and the history of architecture more broadly? Because he, as I sort of talked about in the introduction, he sort of, to my mind, he's always sat outside of things a bit. You know, he's a modernist, but he's also doing something else. You know, I always think of him in relation not to necessarily other modernists, but in relation to people like John Soane or Ledoux, or an architect who has something, there's some way kind of more in common with kind of ancient Rome than he does perhaps with some of the other things that were going on that were contemporary to him. Is that a kind of sort of fanciful historian's way of seeing, or almost a kind of critic's way of seeing this architect? Or should we see him more kind of embedded in a particular moment in time, a particular place, a particular set of circumstances? Or is he both? Elaine, you're looking very animated.
I'm nodding because I was just thinking both at that same point. And I think it's that universality, that appeal for historians, that he people who don't relate to modernism, but look at Sohn and so forth, do relate to Kahn, somehow makes him greater than Le Corbusier and other contemporaries. Though obviously for architects, he does have that particular modernist importance too. I think it's interesting for me, I really became aware of him when he was promoted by the postmodernists. So I had to sort of unlearn that and then come to appreciate him. And it is that universality, I think, that is so important.
Olaf?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to place. And I think that's very much quality, because in that and since then he is impossible to copy. People can, or architects or designers can take from him in many different ways. And of course, he has had a lot of influence. If you look upon the Fisher House in relation to being spaces without corridor, if you look upon the mother house of the Dominican sisters, in which then spaces comes together in a particular way. If you look upon the Japanese architecture, one has understood Kahn in very much a stronger way. So I think it's, again, difficult to copy, and it's therefore also is easy to take, to be inspired of a certain part of it, instead of being able to say that he belongs to a particular style, because I do think that it's impossible, actually. At the same time, it's not an image architecture. It's not you can see it on the outside and say it's great or it's beautiful, and when it's over, and then it's over. No, you have to truly experience the space. You have to be inside the space. Therefore, it is also difficult to make photos. Due to that, you have to sense which I call the energy in the space itself. And after all, that was also what he was after. So in this relationship of sort of a commonness that you can pass by, but when you are inside it, you are taken by its strength.
Marie, is there anything you would like to add?
I totally agree. I have the same experience that when you experience Kahn's architecture firsthand, when you are in the buildings, you feel so good somehow. Where does it come from? I have no answer yet. Where does it come from? And you cannot photograph the feeling of your own feeling. And then you are disappointed with your own photographs of Kahn's architecture. And when you visit, for example, Venturi's architecture, then it is so photogenic or photogenic. It's so easy to make high quality photos, but maybe these are made more for photographs, not for feeling. Yeah, such dilemma.
That was interesting, in relation to, I forget which project it was, Elaine, that you showed, but you couldn't get a good photograph of it. The building resisted.
I mean, it really is difficult. I agree absolutely with what the others were saying, and postmodernism is so flat and photographs so beautifully. It's really funny.
Yeah.
Of course, Kahn had a very much a respect for Venturi, and when Venturi was the first architect that Kahn hired in his education team, so they went different ways, but the respect between them was certainly there, and also sort of the different attitude that they came up with at the end. But they certainly respected one another.
Yeah, and the common start is what makes them so fascinating, I think.
Well, that's a whole other discussion, so maybe we'll have to have a sequel to this event. But we just need to draw things to a close, and just to refer back to the questions from the audience. We've got several questions that are about how we kind of place Kahn, which we've sort of answered already, and also there's a final question that's just come in about someone who's seen his work in Bangladesh and spoken to Bangladeshi architects, and has talked about how modern Bangladeshi architecture has been quite influenced by Kahn and obviously what he created there. But I just wanted to kind of link that back to something that Per Olaf said at the very end of your presentation. You talked about how in Kahn's architecture or in his kind of approach more broadly, there are these clues essential to the future of architecture, and I wondered, I guess specifically to you, what those clues might be, and then just to the whole group, I wanted to ask really kind of what should architects practicing now take from Kahn? What can they draw? I mean, obviously he's working completely different political, economic situations, of course. But what can, given that he's difficult to copy, as you mentioned, Per Olaf, but what is about Kahn that should be being picked up by architects working today?
Is it?
Well, maybe if you want to start.
Okay.
See how far we get. I realize it's a very big question.
Yes, but my remark might come as a surprise. But when you truly enter his thinking, is his strong relationship to nature, that he really respects nature, and that we have to reach another understanding of that relationship, also within architecture. And it came very much as a surprise for me that this was very important for him, not only in his work, but also very much in his thinking. So I do think that is one part. Another thing is the idea of what, and a deeper understanding of what we actually are doing before we do things. So his pedagogical attitude in relation to that, but also the professional attitude of bringing forward that question. What are we actually doing beyond the idea of the service, to put it that way? And maybe architecture is not interested in going in that way, but for him, that was essential. This attempt to try to understand what the key issue in any project is. And of course, there are many ways of doing that, independent of his creative approach. But the question that he asks, I feel, is essential in that sense. And if you read his sentences or phrases more deeper than you think they are poetic, behind them is very much many of these things that relate also to the future of architecture, that can be interpreted anew over and over again, actually.
Elaine, Marie, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I've been fascinated like starting point, taking human beings as starting point, and maybe also the measures that are for the human beings. Even the most monumental buildings, they consist of like smaller pieces that are not understandable for or like how to say, no, a human being in one sense. And another thing that I have been admiring Yes, but still how he coded his personal history into buildings. There are some more examples like his scars in the face. In Kimball Museum, there is very good contrast between Louis Kahn's concrete and Renzo Piano's concrete. And when Renzo Piano's concrete is very smooth, like industrial, but Louis Kahn's concrete is full of scars. And those people whom I met, engineers who worked with Kahn, they said this was their idea, that Kahn coded his own scars into the concrete. And this makes, so it means that his buildings are from one point of view very perfect, but there is always some kind of error or mistake in the buildings that make them more human-like. They are not too industrial, not too perfect, but they are like human beings. And this is, they have a soul, so-called. And this is something incredible, simply.
I think I just wanted to draw out the importance of the brief and the infinite patience with which he would assemble and pull together and pull apart and work infinitely to get the plan right, even whatever the textures and materiality. And am I right in thinking that he only ever made any money on the Salk Institute, but all the other projects lost? I don't know if that's true or not, but it sort of says something. So don't copy Kahn if you want to be a successful architect in that sense.
But do copy him if you want to create great architecture, or at least try to emulate rather than copy. It's time to draw things to a close, and I want to thank our speakers for an incredibly rich and stimulating series of presentations and discussion. And thank you to everyone who posted questions, and sorry if we didn't get to yours, and also apologies for the technical problems that we suffered midway, and thank you for sticking with us during those. This event has been organised by the Estonian Embassy in London in partnership with the Louis Kahn Estonia Foundation. It's had support from the Norwegian Embassy in London and the municipality of Saaremaa. Thanks also to London Festival of Architecture, which this event has been part of. And please check out louiskahn.org for upcoming Louis Kahn 120 events taking place actually all around the world. We're going to conclude with a short teaser of a film that was actually shot only last weekend at Kahn's birthplace on the island of Saaremaa. And the full film that this is a teaser for is going to be premiering at Archtober Festival in New York this October. So if you happen to be in New York or near New York, please do check it out. But thank you ever so much for watching this event. Thank you once again to our speakers, and please do enjoy the teaser film. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hallo. Tere, Olavi. Kuule, ma olen nüüd siin oma vanaema maja ukse ees, pikk 19. Ja kaua sul läheb?
No, ma hakkan liikumise juures tulema, ma arvan, mitte üle 10 minutit.
Selge, ma olen siin samas, jalutan kuskil edasi-tagasi, ootan sind. Rõõm näha.
Täpselt õige koht.
Võib-olla see ongi.
Ei, vaata, nüüd ma ajan segamini. See on see maja siin. Ja näed, siin oli hotell Peterburi. Siit me saame jah turule. Ühe päevaga nimetati ümber mingi 24 tänavat või midagi. Ja siis olid kõik muidugi need traditsioonilised Lenini ja Lossi tänav oli üldse pikka aega Stalini Saksa okupatsiooni ajal Hitleri, siis ta oli nii nagu
ja mitte ainult tänavad, vaid ka linn oli pingisse.
Ja see oli siis 52 kuni 88.
Vaatasid, et 2 ülbet venda.
Jah, ülbitsuvad.
Meil on siin sees käinudki.
Siin on mingid kommentaarid ka ikkagi. Siis mul praegu tuli meelde, et kuidas mina Kahniga tuttavaks sain nii-öelda. Ma tulin 1974 sügisel tulin Saaremaale tööle ja parajasti kunstis ilmus Elain Künnapuu imekombel niisugune tutvustav artikkel Louis Kahnist. Ja seal oli märgitud ka, et Kuressaares sündinud ja nõnda. Minul jäi suu veidi lahti, ma ei olnud kuulnud muidugi nime, siis 1974, eks ole. Ja siis hakkasin seda asja uurima ja siis mõtlesin, et oi, et seda peab kohalikus ajakirjandus tutvustama ja siis meil oli muidugi ainuke ajaleht oli Kommunismi ehitaja ja siis selle jaoks põhiliselt selle Künnapuu artikli põhjal ja kuskilt vist leidsin veel midagi juurde teatmeteostest, tegin artikli, et nii vägev mees on meil sündinud. Aga artikkel jäi ilmumata, miks ma ei saanud teada ja siis kui Kommunismi ehitaja oli saanud meie maa, aga see vana toimetaja oli elus veel ja siis ükskord, kui me saime kokku, tal oli ikka see südame peal, tal oli meeles, et tead Olav ja anna andeks, et ma ei saanud seda artiklit avaldada, et see oli ameeriklasest ja pealegi veel põgenikust. Et jah, niimoodi, niisugune lugu oli. Kogu see pargi kujunemine ja kuussääli ehitamine ja mõned muud puurtooned siin. See on kõik seotud sellega, et Kuressaare 19. sajandi keskpaigast alates hakkas kujunema puurtooned.
Kuule, aga räägi natukene selle lossi sünniloost. Paneks ta kuidagi ajaliselt paika. Sest see aeg, mis meid huvitab, 19 lõpp 20. algus, oli ta ju sellisena enam-vähem vist olemas, õigus?
Ja sel ajal ta oli selline ja väike laus Mulovski, kui ta siin ringi kalpsas, siis ta ikka seda umbes sellisel kujul ka nägi. Aga kas ta sel ajal just siseruumidesse pääses, seda ei tea, sest 1904 Saaremaa rüütelkond, kelle valduses sel ajal oli, alustas siin põhjalike renoveerimistöid, et oma esindusruumid siia seada. Aga enne seda muidugi oli väga pikk ja keeruline ajalugu, mis sai alguse siis piiskopi linnusest, mis ehitati siia kuskil 14. sajandi, teisel poolel, ütleme nii, ümmarguselt. Ja
suur tänu. See on lest vist, jah?
See on nüüd praelest.
Väga hea, aitäh.
Ja sooja pannid ja veidi jogurtikast. Väga mõnus.
Teeme uuesti.